I don't have any motivation to teach. I don't have any motivation to teach. I don't experience myself as a teacher. I don't have any of that experience, so I don't know how to answer the question. Well, I don't relate to cause and effect, so, you know, if I were to move, in quotes, forward into some kind of thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions, and all that stuff, I could say the cause of suffering is blah, blah. But there's no cause or not cause. Again, we're in words, we're in language. So the minute I say, why is there suffering, with even the word why, where the stuck point is that it presupposes there's an answer. So the question presupposes an answer. So is there an answer prior to the word why? So once you eliminate why and because, and that's gone, there's no where, because there's no location. There's no time, so there's no when. So all these things disappear as you see it, just as they're talking about linguistics. Prior to those words, they don't exist. And quantum physics and neuroscience actually bear them both out, fortunately. But if they didn't, it's still the way it is. Give me a short interview. Doesn't exist. Remember the mantra, doesn't exist. Well, so self-inquiry, as Romano would say it is, there are basically three positions. The first position is we have thought, 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 thought. Romano's going to say, trace the I thought. So you can say, to where does that thought subside? And notice the space. To where does that thought subside? To where does that thought subside? Or, that's one. The second position would be, from where does that thought arise? So rather than tracing it forward, in quotes, to where it subsides, now we're going to look like, from where does it arise? So same space, just looking at it from here or from here, so to speak. The third, which is the most famous, is, he would say, you ask yourself, to whom does this thought arise? You answer, to me. And you say, who is this I? So in his thing is basically, if I have a thought called, I love myself or I hate myself, you'd say, to whom does this thought arise? It arises to me. Who is this I? So the I thought then moves us from I subject, I love myself or I hate myself, to I object, obviously, and it disappears. There are two pieces to appreciate in it. The first piece is, not to add on to Maharishi, but there's two pieces. Is that, number one, that the thought arises in subside space, arises in subside space. And as we all know, anybody that does this kind of practice or has done that kind of practice is, you can sit in meditation and you go to, where does that thought subside? And there's nothing. And another thought will arise called, you know, when you have a pizza or something, and to where does that thought subside? Now, people assume that quiet stillness is, in quotes, it. The problem is that the thought and that space are made of the same substance. It's a holographic piece. So if I go into space between two thoughts, eventually the space is going to create the thought back. So the space is not something that you want. The space is a preliminary step or station. So if we're in Sufi land, they would say that everything, in Buddhist land, they would say everything's a state. It's temporary. It's not permanent. In Sufi land, they would call them stations. So if I was taking a ride on a train from San Francisco to New York, then I would have San Francisco. The next stop would be Salt Lake City, called, I'm not my thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions, but I don't want to get off the train there. It's a station. Next station could be Denver. Next station could so on. So most preliminary practice in most systems, their attempt is to get you to not identify with thoughts, feelings, emotions, associations, perceptions, etc., which Maharishi is doing. And then basically, when that happens, you're just in this still space. Now, if you, in quotes, move forward, then all of a sudden you call this space now, which means now you're in time, which doesn't exist. Or you start moving forward, you go, now in present time, even more forward. Or even more, in quotes, seductive is, I'm now the observer of thoughts, my thoughts, as if they're yours, which presupposes there's only one observer when there's an infinite number of observers. Basically, the problem is that people imagine that there's one stable observer. So in other words, there's an observer here, we'll call it, And then a thought arises called, I love myself, or a thought, I hate myself, or I'm glad I'm listening, or I don't give a shit, whatever it is, rising side. And there's one observer. But actually there's not. With every thought that arises / experience, there's a different observer. So if I have a thought called, so you have a dyad. You have an observer and an observed, or a knower and a known. So if the observer is observing the thought called, I love myself, arise and subside. I hate myself. New observer, new thought, arise and subside. And the answer to the question would be, the proof of that is, there's two. One is, if you notice the thought right now, whatever that thought is, and you asked yourself, what observer is observing that, you would go blank. You'd go blank because you'd be prior to the observer-observed dyad. The other process would be, notice a thought, be the observer of the thought, and what happens if the observer of the thought and the thought are made of the same substance. So there's an infinite number of observers, so a lot of systems have a problem with the observer, which is observing now the presupposition inside the observers. I'm observing my thoughts, when they're not my thoughts. Just different states that are arising, subsiding, and nothing whatsoever to do with me. It would be like me being the ocean and there's a wave up there somewhere.